Translator disappears during million-dollar negotiation. And a cleaner does the impossible. Chaos erupts when the company realizes there's no one to lead the international meeting that could save its future. While executives panic, an invisible cleaning lady takes charge and unveils a past no one ever imagined. What happens next exposes corporate flaws, makes headlines, and redefines what it truly means to be indispensable. The clock hands advanced relentlessly at the headquarters of Albright Ventures, one of the largest business conglomerates in the United States. The imposing mirrored glass building reflected New York City's gray sky, as if nature itself understood the tension in the air. Only 30 minutes remained until the start of a meeting that would decide the corporation's fate. Richard Albright, the company's CEO and heir to its founder, nervously paced his spacious 30th floor office. His face, usually impassive, betrayed signs of worry. In recent weeks, pressure on the leadership had grown exponentially. Accumulated debts, budget cuts, and imminent layoffs threatened to destroy the empire built by his family over 3 generations. "Where's Maurice?" "He should be here by now," Richard exclaimed, checking his watch for the 10th time in 5 minutes. His assistant, Beatrice, hesitated before responding. "Sir, I just received a call. Dr. Taylor was in an accident on the Belt Parkway. Nothing serious, but he's in the hospital and won't be able to attend." A heavy silence fell over the room. Maurice Taylor was the official translator and international business advisor, a crucial piece for the meeting with the French investors. Without him, communication would be impossible, and that meeting represented salvation or total ruin. "Cancel everything," Richard murmured, running a hand through his graying hair. "Impossible. Sir, Mr. Bertrand and his entourage are already on their way. Cancelling now would be a diplomatic disaster and would likely end any possibility of an agreement." The news spread quickly among the executives. Cell phones vibrated non-stop. Advisors pressed for a miraculous solution. The atmosphere bordered on collapse when, in the midst of the confusion, a discreet figure appeared at the door. It was a woman of approximately 50 years old in uniform, pushing a cleaning cart. Cecilia Morrison had worked for 3 years at the company, always passing unnoticed through the corridors. Her face had striking features, a discreet beauty that time hadn't managed to erase, but which few noticed beneath her simple uniform and the severe bun that held her brown hair. For a few moments, Cecilia remained still, observing the chaotic scene. Then she took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said in a low voice. No one heard her. She repeated louder, "Excuse me, gentlemen." Some heads turned, expressions of irritation visible. Who was this cleaner to interrupt a crisis of this magnitude? "I could help if you'd allow me," Cecilia continued, holding Richard Albright's gaze. "I'm fluent in French and have experience in international negotiations." An incredulous silence followed her declaration. Richard frowned, examining her with a mixture of despair and distrust. "You? Fluent in French? And with negotiation experience?" "Oui, monsieur. Je parle français couramment, et j'ai une vaste expérience dans les négociations internationales," she replied with a perfect Parisian accent. "I can translate the meeting and, if necessary, assist with technical matters." The executives exchanged astonished glances. Mark Fenton, the financial director, let out a scoffing laugh. "Richard, don't tell me you're considering putting a cleaner in charge of negotiating Albright's future." The room erupted in comments, but Richard raised his hand, silencing everyone. His eyes did not leave Cecilia's serene face. "Why should we trust you?" he asked directly. "Because you have no choice," she replied simply. "And because I know the debt restructuring you intend to propose. I've spent the last few weeks cleaning this room during the preparatory meetings. I know the company faces an unprecedented liquidity crisis, and that the agreement with the Bertrand Group is your last hope." The CEO paled. This invisible woman, who cleaned the floor beneath their feet, knew more about the company's situation than he imagined. "Give me 10 minutes, Cecilia said. "Ask me some technical questions. If I fail, you can proceed with the original plan and cancel the meeting." In the following minutes, the executives bombarded her with questions about international finance, Franco-American commercial law, and specific contract terms. To general astonishment, her answers were precise and articulate, demonstrating knowledge that went far beyond what was expected. "How?" Richard began, but was interrupted by the intercom. "Mr. Albright, the French delegation has just arrived in the lobby," the receptionist announced. There was no more time. Richard looked at the advisors, who reluctantly nodded. It was a huge risk, but also their only chance. "Beatrice, take Mrs. Morrison." "Cecilia Morrison. Take Mrs. Morrison to the executive changing room. Find something appropriate for her to wear. Quickly." As she was led through the corridors she knew so well, but had never walked as an equal, Cecilia felt a mix of contradictory emotions. Fear, nostalgia, hope. How long had she waited for an opportunity like this? How many times had she dreamed of returning to the world from which she had been brutally torn? In the changing room, Beatrice opened a locker containing spare executive attire. She chose a navy blue blazer and dress pants set, a white blouse and elegant shoes. "Are you sure you can do this?" the assistant asked, handing her the clothes. Cecilia took the pieces carefully, like someone receiving a long-lost treasure. "I am. I've done this many times. In another life." When the door closed, Cecilia stood alone before the mirror. She slowly removed her cleaner's uniform and piece by piece put on the executive suit. She let her hair down from the tight bun, letting it fall over her shoulders in waves marked by the elastic. She looked at her reflection, lines marked by years of anonymity, but also eyes that carried an untold story. At that moment, as if in a fast-motion film, she reviewed the last 10 years of her life, the fall, the humiliation, the silent struggle. She remembered Luke, her son who was now studying engineering at MIT thanks to her hard work. Her ailing mother, who depended on her care. She thought of Henry, her ex-husband who had ruined her reputation and career. "It's just one meeting," she whispered to herself, adjusting her blazer. Her single meeting, but she knew it was much more. It was her chance to rise from the ashes, to show the world, and especially herself, that Cecilia Morrison still existed beneath Mrs. C's uniform, the invisible cleaner. She took a deep breath, lifted her chin and walked towards the door. On the other side, a new chapter of her life was about to begin. On her way to the meeting room, Cecilia crossed paths with Mrs. Zelda, a colleague from the cleaning department, who stared at her open-mouthed. The two women exchanged a meaningful look, a mixture of complicity and disbelief. Cecilia felt her heart race. It was as if she were walking on a thin line between two worlds that should never meet. "Good luck, C," Zelda whispered, using the nickname by which she was known. That simple wish of good luck carried the weight of all the conversations shared during breakfast breaks in the staff kitchen. Stories of sacrifices, postponed dreams, dignity preserved despite adversity. Cecilia nodded, feeling she represented all those invisible people who kept the company running behind the scenes. Beside Richard Albright, she entered the imposing meeting room. The French delegation was already seated, 5 men and 2 women in impeccable suits, emanating the characteristic confidence of those who hold decision-making power over billions. "Monsieur Bertrand, c'est un plaisir de vous rencontrer," Cecilia greeted with ease, extending her hand to the middle-aged man leading the group. "Je suis Cecilia Mendonça, directrice des relations internationales." Jean-Philippe Bertrand shook her hand, visibly surprised by her fluent French. A brief introduction of the other participants followed, and soon everyone was seated at the large oval table. Richard cast her a look that was both hopeful and apprehensive. It was the moment of truth. The meeting began with the usual formalities. Cecilia translated each word, each nuance with precision, interspersing insightful comments that demonstrated her deep knowledge of the subject. Gradually, the atmosphere, initially tense and formal, began to relax. The French seemed impressed not only with her fluency in the language, but also with the financial and legal complexities involved in the transaction. As she skillfully conducted the negotiation, Cecilia's mind intermittently wandered to the past, to who she had been before she became invisible in the eyes of society. 10 years ago, Cecilia Morrison was one of the most respected financial consultants in the country. Graduating with honors from MIT, with an MBA from Harvard, she had built a brilliant career becoming a specialist in international mergers and acquisitions. She had been a director at one of the largest consulting firms in the United States, a sought-after speaker at international conferences, an example of a successful woman in a predominantly male environment. Her personal life also seemed a picture of perfection. Married to Henry Vance, a renowned economist and government consultant, mother of Luke. Then an 8-year-old boy, she lived in a penthouse on the Upper East Side and frequented the most exclusive circles of New York City's elite. Then, on a seemingly ordinary September day, everything collapsed. Cecilia was in her office when federal agents raided the premises with a search and seizure warrant. The accusations were serious: participation in a scheme of currency evasion and money laundering involving offshore companies linked to important clients. At the center of the scheme was her husband, Henry. Investigations revealed that Henry had used companies in Cecilia's name for fraudulent operations, taking advantage of her signature on documents that she, blindly trusting her partner, had never read carefully. Although the evidence pointed to her innocence, she was truly unaware of the operations. The media scandal was devastating. Her consulting firm, fearing association with the case, immediately fired her. Clients distanced themselves. Friends disappeared. Her cell phone stopped ringing. Doors closed. Within weeks, she found herself transformed from a respected consultant into the woman of the money laundering scandal. Henry was preventively arrested and later sentenced to 8 years in prison. The divorce was inevitable and painful. With her reputation destroyed, Cecilia tried to start over. She sent out resumes, sought old contacts, looked for opportunities in smaller cities, but her name had become toxic in the financial market. To make matters worse, Cecilia's mother, who lived in Boston, suffered a stroke and had to move to New York City, depending entirely on her daughter's care. With savings rapidly depleting due to high medical treatment costs, Cecilia faced the harsh reality. She needed a job. Any job. She started as a supermarket cashier, then a department store salesperson, and finally found some stability as an outsourced cleaner for companies. Ironically, that's how she came to Albright Ventures 3 years ago, cleaning the same corridors where she once walked as a guest consultant. Madame Morrison. Jean-Philippe Bertrand's voice brought her back to the present. Vous semblez distraite. Tout va bien. Oui, excusez-moi, she replied promptly, regaining her focus. We were discussing the debt convertibility clause, correct? The meeting continued. Cecilia felt the evaluating glances of the American executives, especially Mark Fenton, who observed her with ill-disguised suspicion. She knew that type of man well, the same one who, years ago, treated her as an equal in meeting rooms, and who now barely noticed her presence when she emptied his wastebasket. During a coffee break, Richard called her aside. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked in a low voice, genuinely intrigued. Cecilia hesitated. She wasn't prepared to reveal her story. "Not yet. I lived in France for many years. So I worked in international trade," she answered vaguely. Richard studied her for a few moments, clearly perceiving that there was much more behind that evasive answer. "Whoever you were or are, Cecilia, you are saving my company today. Keep it up." The second part of the meeting promised to be even more challenging. It was time to discuss the specific terms of the financial agreement: rates, guarantees, payment schedule. That's when Cecilia noticed something strange in the document the French had brought. As she translated the terms, her years of experience in international finance triggered an alert in her mind. There were small discrepancies between the English and French versions of 3 specific clauses. Subtle differences in language that, to a common translator, would go unnoticed, but which significantly altered the risk assumed by the American party. Discreetly, she grabbed a notepad and began taking notes while continuing the translation. She needed time to better analyze those clauses before pointing out any problems. If she was right, the French group was trying to insert predatory conditions into the agreement, taking advantage of Albright's vulnerability. Around her, the meeting flowed with increasing optimism. Richard smiled for the first time in weeks. The advisors exchanged relieved glances. Even Mark Fenton seemed less tense. No one noticed what Cecilia had just discovered, that they were about to sign a contract that could hand over control of the company for a pittance. The clock in the room showed 4:45 p.m. The negotiation was moving into its final phase. Cecilia knew she needed to act, but she hesitated. Revealing the problem would mean confronting the powerful French investors, risking the agreement the company so desperately needed, and inevitably exposing herself even further. For a moment, she thought about staying silent. After all, what did she owe Albright Ventures? a company that had never noticed her existence, where she was just another faceless, nameless, outsourced employee. Why risk the new opportunity that was emerging in her life? Then she remembered Mrs. Zelda and the other cleaning, security, and kitchen staff, people who would lose their jobs if the company was swallowed up by foreigners interested only in its assets. She also remembered herself, the values she had always defended, the ethical professional she had been before the scandal. "Gentlemen," she finally said, interrupting one of the Frenchmen, "I believe we need to take a short break to clarify some specific points of the contract before we proceed." All eyes turned to her, surprised by the interruption. Jean-Philippe frowned, visibly annoyed. "Any problem, madame?" "Possibly," Cecilia replied, holding his gaze. "And I believe everyone here would like to clarify it before it's too late." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The tension returned, denser and more palpable. Richard cast her an interrogative look, mixing concern and confusion. Cecilia knew she was at a crossroads. The next step could lead her back to the corporate world or permanently return her to invisibility. Taking a deep breath, she prepared for the confrontation that could change not only Albright's fate, but also her own. "Gentlemen, I suggest a 15-minute break," Cecilia said firmly, yet without losing diplomacy. "Mr. Albright, may we speak privately?" Richard nodded, disconcerted. The French investors exchanged uneasy glances as the American executives rose, confused. Jean-Philippe Bertrand, with a forced smile, consulted his Patek Philippe. 15 minutes no more, he warned in French, with a tone that mixed cordiality and threat. As soon as they were alone in the adjacent room, Richard blurted out, "What's going on, Cecilia? We were about to close the deal." "Precisely why we need to talk," she replied, spreading the contract on the table. "I've noticed critical inconsistencies between the English and French versions in 3 specific clauses. These aren't translation errors, Mr. Albright. These are deliberate alterations." With surgical precision, Cecilia pointed out the discrepancies. In the first, a subtle change of verb tense in French completely altered the grace period for payments. In the second, the inclusion of the term subsidiarily in the English version, absent in the French, created a joint liability that exposed assets unrelated to the agreement. The third was the most serious. A cross-default clause that would allow the French to take over share control if any company in the Albright Group experienced financial problems in the next 5 years. "This isn't a debt restructuring," Cecilia concluded. "It's a hostile takeover disguised as a bailout." Richard paled. His shoulders, always erect from military discipline, slumped as if the weight of that revelation was physical. Maurice. Would he have noticed this? The question hung in the air. Cecilia hesitated, aware of the implications. If the official translator had noticed the discrepancies and not alerted the company, it would mean he was bought by the French. So serious accusation without proof. "I cannot say, sir. I prefer to believe that these clauses were inserted recently, perhaps after his last review." Richard ran a hand over his face, trying to absorb the situation. "Now what? If we refuse the deal, the company goes bankrupt in weeks. If we sign, we lose everything anyway, just slower and with the illusion of control," Cecilia completed. "But there is a third way." In the following minutes, she outlined a daring strategy. They would rewrite the problematic clauses right there, presenting them as translation corrections. Simultaneously, they would show the French that they had noticed the maneuver, signaling that they were not as vulnerable or desperate as they appeared. "It's risky," Richard pondered. "They might just get up and leave." "They might," Cecilia agreed, "but I doubt they will. There's something more here, Mr. Albright. They could simply wait for Albright to go bankrupt and buy the assets for pennies. Why this elaborate restructuring strategy? What does your company have that they want so badly?" Richard hesitated, assessing how much he could trust this woman who, until that morning, was just an anonymous cleaner. Something in her eyes, a mixture of sharp intelligence and unbreakable integrity, made him decide. "The Albright 723 patent," he revealed in a low voice. "We've developed a revolutionary process for water desalination using solar energy. Very low cost, high efficiency. It can transform arid regions into productive ones. The American Southwest would be the first beneficiary, but the global potential is incalculable." Cecilia nodded. the pieces falling into place. With climate change exacerbating global water scarcity, whoever controls this technology will have unimaginable power. And incomparable fortunes, Richard completed. I sold part of the company to finance the final development phase. I thought we would have enough time to recover the investment, but the economic crisis accelerated everything. So that's it, Cecilia concluded. They're not after Albright. They're after the patent. The 15 minutes were almost up. Quickly, they reformulated the problematic clauses, incorporating safeguards for the patent and establishing clear limits for French interference in the company's operations. When they returned to the main room, Cecilia carried not only the revised contract, but also a new negotiation strategy. The game had changed. Messieurs, mesdames, she began confidently, distributing the new pages. We have identified some translation inconsistencies that could cause future problems. We have made the necessary corrections to ensure that both parties are fully aware of their obligations and rights. Jean-Philippe slowly leafed through the pages, his face an impenetrable mask of professional cordiality. His advisers, however, could not hide their discomfort. These are not mere translation corrections, madame, he finally replied. These are substantial alterations to the agreed terms. Indeed, Cecilia admitted, abandoning the pretense. These are alterations that accurately reflect what was verbally agreed upon in our previous discussions. Or am I mistaken? The Frenchman stared at her for a long time, recognizing the formidable adversary who had unexpectedly appeared at the table. An almost imperceptible smile formed on his lips, the reluctant respect of a predator facing prey that proves equally dangerous. You had someone who knows well the value of what is being negotiated here, Cecilia interrupted, including the true asset that interests the Bertrand Group. A tense silence dominated the room. The American executives, except Richard, seemed lost in the coded conversation. Perhaps we should review our approach, Jean-Philippe finally suggested. Clearly, we underestimated our American partners. The following hours were of intense negotiation. Cecilia, with a poise that made clear her deep knowledge of international finance, led the defense of Albright's interests. She proposed a joint venture structure for the development and commercialization of the desalination technology, guaranteeing the American company majority control over the patent. Mark Fenton, initially skeptical, now observed her with a mixture of admiration and distrust. During a brief break, he approached her. "Who are you really?" he asked in a low voice. "No cleaner speaks like that, negotiates like that." "Perhaps the problem isn't who I am," Cecilia replied calmly, "but the fact that you've never truly looked at the people who clean your office every day." The financial director recoiled, uncomfortable with the direct answer. At that moment, for the first time, he truly looked at Cecilia, not the improvised executive, but the woman behind the role. A woman who clearly carried a much more complex history than he had imagined. As the sun began to set, painting the New York City skyscrapers, visible through the enormous windows in orange, the negotiation finally reached a balance. The French accepted the main American demands, in exchange for a relevant but non-controlling stake in the international exploitation of the patent. "I believe we have reached a mutually beneficial agreement," Jean-Philippe declared, extending his hand to Richard. "Thanks in large part to the extraordinary Madame Morrison." As she signed the final documents, Cecilia felt an almost forgotten emotion, professional satisfaction, the intellectual pleasure of a well-conducted negotiation. For a few hours, she had returned to being who she was before, the respected professional, the astute strategist. The French delegation said goodbye with promises to return the following week to finalize operational details. When the last of them left, the meeting room erupted in subdued celebrations. Richard hugged the advisers, relieved. Albright was saved, and on terms much more favorable than anyone would have imagined that morning. Amidst the celebration, Cecilia remained silent, a little apart. Gradually, the adrenaline of the negotiation gave way to uncertainty. What would happen now? In a few hours, she had gone from invisibility to the center of attention. But would it be a temporary or lasting change? "Gentlemen, I need a moment alone with Mrs. Morrison," Richard said, dismissing the other executives. When they were alone, the CEO walked to the bar in the corner of the room, poured 2 glasses of whiskey, and offered one to Cecilia. "I'll be direct," he said after a long sip. "I want to know who you are. The whole truth this time." Cecilia took a deep breath. The moment she had dreaded had arrived. She could lie, create a plausible story. But she was tired of living in the shadows, of denying her past. "My name is Cecilia Morrison," she began, her voice firm despite the internal turmoil. 10 years ago, I was a director at Prisma Financial Consulting, specializing in international mergers and acquisitions. Before that, I built my career at the World Bank and the National Investment Bank. As she spoke, she carefully observed Richard's reactions. The gradual recognition on his face confirmed what she feared. He was beginning to associate her name with the scandal. "Henry Vance's wife," Richard murmured. "I remember the case. That was headline news for weeks." "Ex-wife," Cecilia corrected, and, as was later proven, completely innocent of the accusations. But that didn't matter. "My name was tainted, my reputation destroyed." She then recounted how, after countless closed doors, she accepted increasingly modest jobs until she reached the position of cleaner. How she single-handedly supported her son through university and cared for her ailing mother. How, despite everything, she never stopped studying, keeping up with the market, keeping her knowledge alive. "Life takes strange turns," she concluded. "This morning I was cleaning the bathroom on this floor. Now I'm here, drinking 12-year-old whiskey with the CEO." Richard observed her for long moments, processing that extraordinary story of fall and resilience. "What do you intend to do now?" he finally asked. "Go back to the cleaning cart tomorrow as if nothing happened." Cecilia hadn't thought that far ahead. She was prepared to justify her past, not to plan her future. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "It depends on what happens when I walk out that door." Richard placed his glass on the table, took a small sip and looked directly into her eyes. "Cecilia, Albright Ventures urgently needs someone with your skills, someone who understands the international market, who speaks fluent French, who has the shrewdness you demonstrated today." He paused significantly. "I would like to offer you the position of Director of International Business, with an immediate focus on the partnership with the Bertrand Group." The proposal, as direct as it was unexpected, left her momentarily speechless. It was the opportunity she had dreamed of for a decade, the chance to return to the corporate world through the front door, to rebuild her career, to use her talents and knowledge again. But before she could answer, the office door opened. It was Mrs. Zelda timidly holding her cleaning cart. "Excuse me, Mr. Albright. I just came to see if I can clean the room yet." The eyes of the two women met, Cecilia in her executive suit with a glass of whiskey in her hand, Zelda in her grey uniform, her rough hands resting on the cart. Two worlds that should never meet, separated only by circumstances and opportunities, not by ability or worth. In that instant, Cecilia knew exactly what she needed to do. "I accept your proposal, Mr. Albright," Cecilia said after a moment of reflection, "but I have conditions." Richard raised his eyebrows, surprised not by the existence of conditions but by the firmness with which they were announced. The woman before him was not begging for a chance. She was negotiating as an equal. "I'm listening," he replied, indicating that Zelda could enter and begin her work. First, an immediate salary adjustment for the entire outsourced team, cleaning, security, kitchen. No less than 30% above the category floor wage. The demand caught Richard by surprise. He expected requests for bonuses, company shares, executive benefits. But Cecilia's first thought had been for her invisible colleagues. Second, she continued, without giving time for objections, creation of a scholarship fund for children of employees at all levels, with an emphasis on those from low-income backgrounds. Education saved me. It can save others too. Zelda, feigning concentration on her work, could not hide her astonishment. She had never imagined witnessing a scene like that. Third, time to train my replacement in the cleaning department. Mrs. Zelda knows all the procedures and has excellent management skills. I strongly recommend that she be promoted to supervisor. The employee almost dropped the cleaning product she was holding, her name pronounced in a high-level meeting as a recommendation for promotion. It was surreal. And finally, Cecilia paused significantly, full autonomy to implement diversity and inclusion policies in the company, starting with the recruitment of talent from underserved communities and the reintegration of experienced professionals who have been excluded from the market due to ageism or other forms of discrimination. Richard tapped his fingers on the table, evaluating the demands. They were not unreasonable, but they represented a significant change in Albright's corporate culture. Your conditions have considerable financial and structural implications, he pondered. The board will need to approve. Of course, Cecilia agreed. And while they decide, I will continue to be the cleaner on the 30th floor. No problem. The CEO couldn't help but smile. This woman was truly extraordinary. She knew exactly her worth and would not be intimidated. That won't be necessary, he assured her, extending his hand. Consider it approved. Welcome to the Albright executive team, Director Morrison. The handshake sealed much, more than a professional agreement. It was the recognition of a journey of silent resistance, of dignity preserved against all odds. It was finally justice. The next morning, Cecilia arrived at the company for the first time as an executive. She entered through the main lobby, no longer through the service entrance. She was greeted with a personalized badge, not the generic outsourced one she had worn for years. Security guards who once barely noticed her presence now greeted her respectfully. Her first action was to visit the cleaning department. She found her former colleagues already at work, some still unaware of the change, others hearing confused rumors. When she entered the small changing room, there was a moment of stunned silence. "Good morning, everyone," she said simply. "I came to personally thank you for all these years of coexistence and mutual respect." One by one they approached to hug her. Women and men who had shared with her not only hard work, but life stories, difficulties, small joys. People who had seen her come and go every day before sunrise and after sunset. Who had perceived her intelligence and culture, but never treated her with condescension or envy. "Will you forget about us up there, Mrs. C?" asked Mr. George, the oldest in the group. "Never," she replied firmly. "And to prove it, my first meeting will be about you." Indeed, by 10 a.m., Cecilia was already in the meeting room with the Human Resources Department, discussing the immediate implementation of the salary adjustment for outsourced staff. She met resistance as she expected. Arguments about budget, precedents, financial impact. "Do the math," she countered calmly. "How much did outsourced employee turnover cost Albright in the last year? How much did we lose in productivity, with constantly incomplete and rotating teams? What is the value of knowing that those who clean our offices, who prepare our coffee, who protect our facilities are committed to the company because they feel valued by it?" Her argumentation, based on data she herself had collected over years of silently observing the company's operations, was irrefutable. By the end of the meeting, she had not only approval for the adjustment, but also for the creation of a committee for the valorization of frontline work, which would include representatives from all categories. The following weeks were of intense work and adaptation. Cecilia took the lead in negotiations with the Bertrand Group, refining the terms of the agreement and establishing the operational foundations of the partnership. Simultaneously, she implemented her conditions one by one. The scholarship fund was created, Zelda was promoted, and the diversity program began to take shape. Richard Albright, initially cautious, became her strongest ally. He recognized that the company, traditionally conservative, needed this renewal. Cecilia's ideas were not only socially responsible, they were strategically intelligent, improving Albright's organizational climate and public image. But not everything was smooth sailing. Mark Fenton, the financial director, emerged as a silent opponent. Uncomfortable with Cecilia's meteoric rise and the changes she was implementing, he began spreading rumors behind the scenes. He suggested that she had been hired only as a social marketing strategy, or worse, insinuated a personal relationship with Richard. Cecilia was aware of the gossip, but initially chose to ignore it. Her focus was on her work, the consolidation of the partnership with the French, and the implementation of her social initiatives. Additionally, she needed to reorganize her personal life. One Sunday afternoon, sitting in the small living room of her apartment in Queens, Cecilia was talking with Luke, her 18-year-old son. The young man, an engineering student at MIT, was still processing his mother's sudden transformation. "Why did you never tell us? About your past, about who you really were?" he asked, a mixture of admiration and hurt in his voice. Cecilia sighed, carefully choosing her words. At first you were too young to understand. Later, I think I was afraid of creating expectations I couldn't meet. The corporate world had expelled me. Luke, I thought it was permanent, but you kept your knowledge, you kept studying, even working as a cleaner. Because I always knew that knowledge is the only thing no one can take from you, she replied with a serene smile. Remember how many nights I spent studying French with you? Or explaining international economics while I cooked dinner? Luke nodded, recalling the impromptu lessons at the kitchen table, the discussions about international politics while his mother ironed, the books always present in their lives despite financial difficulties. I'm proud of you, Mom, he finally said, hugging her. I always have been. That hug was worth more than all the titles and positions in the world. For him, for her bedridden mother who could now receive proper treatment, for herself, Cecilia had sworn she would make this second chance count. On Monday, she arrived at the company refreshed and determined. She was greeted by Beatrice, now her assistant, with urgent news. The French had moved up their visit and would arrive that afternoon to discuss details of technological implementation. Excellent, Cecilia replied, already mentally planning the meeting. Prepare the meeting room, notify the technical department, and ask Richard to be available from 3 p.m. As she walked to her office, the same space she used to clean daily, she was approached by Mark Fenton. We need to talk, he said curtly. Cecilia nodded, inviting him into her office. She knew this confrontation was inevitable. I hear you've been implementing significant changes without going through the finance committee, he began, barely containing his irritation. Adjustments, funds, programs, all of this costs money, Cecilia. Money the company barely has after almost going bankrupt. All my initiatives have been approved by Richard and have a budget allocated, she responded calmly. If you wish, I can show you the numbers. In fact, some of them, like the outsourced staff adjustment, are already resulting in savings by reducing turnover. The financial director did not seem interested in numbers or facts. His discomfort was deeper, more personal. I'll be frank, he said, lowering his voice. Many here question your sudden rise. A cleaner who becomes a director overnight, implementing policies that seem more like social activism than business strategy. And what exactly are you insinuating, Mark? Cecilia cut him off, maintaining her composure but hardening her tone. Just that perhaps you should tread more carefully. We know about your past, the scandal with your ex-husband. The market has a long memory. The veiled threat hung in the air. Cecilia felt a familiar chill, the same fear that had accompanied her for years after the scandal, the ghost of exclusion, of public humiliation. For an instant she almost faltered. Then she remembered who she was now, what she had achieved, the people who depended on her and believed in her leadership. She faced Mark directly without blinking. Thank you for the advice. Mark, now if you'll excuse me, I have a company to help rebuild. The financial director left, furious at her lack of intimidation. Cecilia knew this was just the beginning. She had created a powerful enemy within the company. But she also knew she wasn't alone. Her allies were not just in the executive suite, but on every floor in every department, especially among those who were once invisible like her. The meeting with the French that afternoon was a success. Jean-Philippe Bertrand, initially surprised to learn of Cecilia's new official position, soon showed genuine respect. The implementation of the desalination technology was progressing on schedule, and the partnership proved promising for both sides. At the end of the day, exhausted but fulfilled, Cecilia was organizing her desk to leave when she received an unexpected call. A voice she hadn't heard in years, the lawyer who had handled her divorce. Mrs. Morrison, I regret to inform you, but I felt it was important to warn you. Your ex-husband, Henry Vance, was granted parole last week, and he seems to be giving interviews mentioning your name. The world seemed to stop for an instant. Henry Free, the man who had destroyed her life, who had used her as a shield while embezzling millions, who had abandoned her to her fate when everything fell apart. He was back. Did he say anything specific about me? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Insinuations, Mrs. Morrison, suggesting that you had knowledge of the operations, that you were a silent accomplice. Nothing that can be configured as direct slander. But enough to rekindle doubts, to bring the past back, Cecilia completed, a cold sensation spreading through her chest. After hanging up, she remained motionless for long minutes. Just when she was rebuilding her life, when she finally saw the light after a decade of darkness, the past returned to haunt her. She needed to prepare for the storm brewing on the horizon, a storm that threatened not only her newly recovered career, but also everything she had been building at Albright, the transformations, the lives she was beginning to positively impact. The real battle was just beginning. The news broke on a Tuesday. Former executive involved in financial scandal resurfaces as Albright director, announced the country's most influential business portal. The article, though largely factual, contained excerpts from an exclusive interview with Henry Vance, newly released after serving time for financial crimes. Cecilia was always extremely intelligent and articulate, he said in the interview. It's impossible she didn't know what was happening. Perhaps she didn't actively participate, but she certainly turned a blind eye to a lot. The insinuation, though carefully formulated to avoid libel lawsuits, was clear. Cecilia was not as innocent as the courts had determined. The journalist responsible for the article went further, questioning the surprising coincidence of a former cleaner saving $1 billion negotiation and then being promoted to director. When Cecilia arrived at the office that morning, she immediately noticed that something had changed. Furtive glances followed her through the corridors. Conversations were abruptly interrupted when she approached. Her cell phone vibrated non-stop with notifications and messages. "Cecilia, my office." Now Richard's voice on the internal phone was tense, urgent. The CEO was not alone. 3 members of the administrative board awaited her, their faces grim, tablets open with the article prominently displayed. On the table, printed copies of other newspapers that were already echoing the case. "Why didn't you tell us the whole story?" Richard questioned bluntly. "I told everything that mattered," Cecilia replied with dignity. "I was exhaustively investigated at the time and demonstrably exonerated. What Henry is doing now is trying to destabilize me because he knows I'm rebuilding my life." "This isn't just about you now," interjected Augustus Meadows, the oldest of the board members. "It's about Albright. We are in a crucial phase of the partnership with the French. A scandal, even an unfounded one, can compromise everything." Cecilia felt a pang of apprehension. She knew that discourse well, the same one she had heard 10 years ago when her former company fired her to preserve institutional reputation. "Are you suggesting I step aside?" she asked directly. The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. It was Richard who replied, "The board recommends a temporary leave of absence until the buzz dies down, just as a precaution." The words hit Cecilia like a physical blow. History was repeating itself. Once again she would be sacrificed for the greater good of the corporation, for the appearance of probity, for the comfort of the shareholders. "I understand," she said simply, her voice controlled despite the inner storm. "How long a temporary leave do you consider appropriate this time? Was 10 years enough last time?" The sarcasm did not go unnoticed. Richard seemed genuinely uncomfortable. "Cecilia, no one here is questioning your competence or integrity. It's just a matter of timing and communication strategy." "Of course," she replied dryly. "It always is." She stood up, gathering all the dignity she could muster. Before leaving, however, she turned to the group. "You have 2 options. You can remove me and implicitly confirm that there's something to hide, reinforcing Henry's insinuations. Or you can keep me and demonstrate unwavering confidence in my integrity, backed by the fact that I was legally exonerated." She paused calculatedly. "Jean-Philippe Bertrand does not negotiate with cowards. Think about that." She left before they could respond, closing the door with controlled firmness. Back in her office, Cecilia found Beatrice visibly nervous. "Is everything all right?" the assistant asked hesitantly. "No, but it will be," she replied with more confidence than she felt. "Please cancel my morning appointments. I need to make some private calls." Alone, she allowed herself a brief moment of despair. All the work, all the careful rebuilding of her life threatened by recycled lies. Why was Henry doing this? What advantage did he gain by destroying her again? She took a deep breath, reorganizing her thoughts. She was no longer the vulnerable and isolated woman of 10 years ago. She had allies, resources, knowledge, and most importantly, the truth on her side. Her first call was to her lawyer. They needed to evaluate legal measures against Henry, and possibly against the media outlets that reproduced accusations without proper counterpoint. The second was to Luke. He needed to hear it directly from her before university colleagues approached him with indiscreet questions. The third phone call surprised even herself. She dialed the number of Regina Allen, an investigative journalist who had questioned the official version at the time of the scandal, being one of the few to point out inconsistencies in the accusation against Cecilia. "Regina? It's Cecilia Morrison. I know it's been a long time, but I need your help. I'm ready to tell my story. The complete truth." The rest of the morning was a flurry of activity. Between meetings with the company's legal counsel and preparations for an exclusive interview with Regina, Cecilia barely had time to emotionally process what was happening. It was like reliving a nightmare, but this time she was awake, aware, ready to fight. Around 1 p.m. she received an unexpected message. A link to an obscure corporate blog, accompanied by a cryptic text. "Not everything is as it seems. Her attached files may be of interest." The sender was anonymous. She hesitated before clicking. It could be a trap, another attack, but her intuition told her otherwise. She accessed the link and found an article published that morning, analyzing connections between Henry Vance and offshore companies recently investigated for money laundering. In the attachments, copies of emails dating back to when Cecilia was still married to him, messages that never passed through her inbox, but which used her name as collateral in shady dealings. That evidence, if authentic, not only reinforced her innocence, but suggested that Henry had continued his illicit activities, even after being released from prison. Most impressively, the perfect timing of the anonymous tip. Whoever it was, they were clearly trying to help her. As she analyzed the material, she was interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Philip Sanders, a young intern from the legal department whom she barely knew. "Excuse me, Director Morrison," he said timidly. I needed to speak with you." Cecilia indicated for him to enter, intrigued by the unexpected visit. "It's about this whole situation," the young man continued, visibly nervous. "I know we don't know each other well, but you inspired me." "Inspired you?" Cecilia repeated, surprised. "Yes, I'm from the South Bronx, the first person in my family to go to university. I got this internship 6 months ago, and since then I've been silently observing how the company works." He paused, searching for the right words. "When I heard your story, how you overcame all obstacles and still didn't forget your origins, didn't let power change who you are, it made me believe that maybe I can get there someday too." Cecilia felt a lump in her throat. In the midst of so much chaos, this young man came to offer not only moral support, but the most sincere recognition she had ever received. "Thank you, Philip." "That means a lot to me today. There's more," he continued, still hesitant. "Your ex-husband, Henry Vance, he has strange connections with the financial director, Mr. Fenton." The revelation dropped like a bomb. Cecilia asked Philip to sit down and detail what he knew. The intern explained that, working with legal documentation, he had noticed email exchanges between Mark Fenton and lawyers who also represented Henry. Nothing explicitly compromising, but too many coincidences to ignore. "Why are you telling me this?" Cecilia asked cautiously. "Because it's not fair," he simply replied. "What they're doing to you isn't fair, and because a lot of people here, especially those of us in the lower ranks, see you as a hope for real change." When the young man left, Cecilia had a lot to process. The possible connection between Mark and Henry would explain the financial director's hostility since her promotion. More than that, it could indicate a coordinated plan to undermine her. She was still absorbing this information when she received a call from Richard. "The board has decided. There will be no leave of absence," he announced without preamble. "We will face this together with a proactive communication strategy. Your interview with Regina Allen has full institutional support." The relief was immense, but Cecilia remained cautious. "What changed?" "Let's just say some board members received interesting calls in the last 90 minutes, Richard replied, with a hint of amusement in his voice. "From the Employees Association, from the Outsourced Workers Union, from 2 federal representatives, from a collective of women executives, even from Jean-Philippe Bertrand expressing full confidence in you." Cecilia could hardly believe it. While she prepared to battle alone, An invisible support network had mobilized around her. "Thank you, Richard. I won't disappoint them." "I know you won't. Oh, and one more thing," the CEO added. "It has come to my attention that Mark Fenton may have undeclared conflicts of interest. I have ordered an internal audit of his communications. For now, this stays between us." Upon hanging up, Cecilia felt a mixture of emotions: relief, gratitude, renewed determination. The fight was far from over, but she was no longer alone. On every floor of that building, people who once felt invisible and powerless now recognized themselves in her and her story. The interview with Regina Allen was scheduled for late afternoon. As she prepared, she received a new message on her phone, this time identified. It was Mrs. Zelda. "Friend, everyone down here is with you. The cleaning staff, security, kitchen. We know who you really are. Everything will be all right." Those simple words brought tears to her eyes. For years she had felt alone, abandoned by a world that had judged her without knowing the facts. Now, as the past returned to haunt her, she discovered that she would never truly be alone again. She wiped away her tears, straightened her posture, and checked the clock. 2 hours remained until the interview that could define her future. It was enough time to gather her evidence, organize her thoughts, and prepare for the definitive confrontation with the shadows of the past. Outside her office, feeling the tension in the air, employees of all levels exchanged worried glances and messages of solidarity. Cecilia's story had in some way become their story too, a narrative of resilience, of dignity preserved against all odds, of hope in a system that often seemed designed to exclude, not to include. On the 28th floor, Mark Fenton nervously watched his cell phone, waiting for a call that didn't come. His plan, so carefully orchestrated with Henry Vance, was beginning to crumble. The woman he intended to destroy proved to be much stronger and much better connected than he had ever imagined. Worse still, the internal audit ordered by Richard would inevitably discover his improper contacts. And in the small apartment in Queens, Luke Morrison prepared to accompany his mother to the most important interview of her life. Unlike 10 years ago, when he was just a confused child seeing his mother unjustly attacked, this time he would be by her side, physically and emotionally, as she finally told her version of the story to the United States. The sun began to set over New York City, casting elongated shadows through the windows of Albright Ventures. It was the end of a day that would mark the beginning of a new chapter, not only for Cecilia Morrison, but for all those who, at some point in their lives, were silenced, underestimated, or unjustly judged. Cecilia's interview with Regina Allen became the most talked-about topic in the country. Broadcast live on one of the main news portals, it reached record viewership numbers. For the first time in 10 years, Cecilia had the opportunity to tell her complete version, unfiltered and without intermediaries. With a firm voice and a direct gaze, she narrated not only the scandal that had destroyed her career, but also the decade of silent reconstruction that followed. She presented evidence, documents, testimonies, all meticulously organized to demonstrate her innocence and expose the contradictions in Henry's recent statements. "I was never a victim," she stated in one of the most impactful moments. "I was wronged, yes, but I chose not to define myself by it. I chose to rebuild day after day, even when no one was looking." The repercussion was immediate and overwhelming. On social media, the hashtag #We'reAllCecilia became a national trending topic. Investigative journalists began to revisit the case, uncovering inconsistencies never before explored. Other media outlets sought Henry for counterpoints, but he suddenly became inaccessible. 3 days after the interview, the real bomb exploded. Based on the anonymous information received by Cecilia and subsequently handed over to the authorities, the Federal Bureau of Investigation opened a new investigation into Henry Vance on suspicion of recidivism in financial crimes. Simultaneously, an independent audit hired by Albright Ventures proved the improper connections between Mark Fenton and Cecilia's ex-husband. He transferred privileged information about the negotiation with the French, Richard explained at an emergency board meeting. Apparently, Henry and associates were planning a financial speculation operation based on the success or failure of our agreement. The defamation campaign against Cecilia was merely a distraction, an attempt to destabilize the company at a crucial moment. Mark's dismissal was unanimous and immediate. In his place, after careful evaluation, the board appointed Cecilia as interim financial director, accumulating the role with her international responsibilities. It was an unequivocal demonstration of confidence, a public recognition of her competence and integrity. Upon taking on the new challenge, Cecilia made a point of first meeting with the operational team in the financial area, analysts, assistants, interns, even before talking to the managers. It was her trademark, valuing the grassroots, recognizing that corporate success fundamentally depends on those who do the daily work, not just those who make strategic decisions. On that Monday morning, as she walked through the corridors to her new office, she was surprised by a spontaneous demonstration. Employees from all departments formed a human corridor, applauding her passage. Smiling faces, some with tears in. Their eyes, people who she might have barely noticed before, now greeted her as a symbol of hope and renewal. "Speech, speech," they chanted in unison. Moved, Cecilia improvised a few words. "I am neither a heroine nor a martyr. I am simply someone who refused to give up, who understood that dignity does not depend on position or status." She paused, searching for familiar faces in the crowd. "Each of you has a story, has value, has potential, that perhaps has not yet been recognized. My mission here is not just to restructure finances or close international deals. It is to help build a company where no one is invisible, where merit prevails over privilege, where diversity is not just discourse but daily practice." The applause echoed through the lobby. Among the employees, Mrs. Zelda smiled proudly, as if she had always known that moment would come. Beside her, Philip Sanders, the young intern who had the courage to expose the suspicious connections, seemed inspired, envisioning possibilities that once seemed unattainable. In the following weeks, the transformation at Albright Ventures was remarkable. Under Cecilia's leadership, the company implemented an innovative internal talent development program with special emphasis on employees from operational areas. The scholarship fund was expanded, benefiting dozens of employees' children. The salary adjustment for outsourced workers became a benchmark in the market, becoming the subject of academic studies on the socio-economic impact of inclusive corporate policies. The partnership with the Bertrand Group advanced steadily. The desalination technology entered a pilot implementation phase on the southwestern coast, promising to revolutionize access to water in regions historically plagued by drought. Jean-Philippe, initially a relentless negotiator, became an enthusiast of the sustainable and socially responsible business model that Cecilia had helped design. "It's not philanthropy," she often explained at business conferences. "It's smart strategy. Companies that invest in their human capital, that respect the communities where they operate, that promote inclusion and diversity, these companies prosper sustainably in the long run." Her assent inspired other women in the corporate environment, especially those who, like her, faced additional barriers due to age, social background, or unconventional professional history. She was invited for mentorships, lectures, television programs. She became a national reference in ethical leadership and social innovation. But for Cecilia, the most significant moments continued to be the small daily encounters with ordinary people whose lives she managed to impact. Like the conversation with Mrs. Janet, one of the company's oldest kitchen staff, who timidly approached her in the cafeteria. "Mrs. Morrison, I wanted to thank you. My granddaughter started college yesterday with the scholarship you created. First person in our family to set foot in a university." Or the message from a former cleaning colleague, Mr. Anthony, who wrote to her after getting a new job, "Thanks to the professional retraining program for seniors. You gave me back my dignity. I thought at 63 I only had retirement left. Now, I'm a technical instructor. I teach young people. I feel useful again." At home, life also flourished. Luke, now in his penultimate year of environmental engineering, decided to specialize in sustainable water treatment technologies, inspired by the project his mother was helping to implement. His mother, Mrs. Francis's health had stabilized, thanks to adequate treatments she could not afford before. The small apartment in Queens, though still simple, now breathed tranquility and hope. One Sunday afternoon, almost a year after the fateful meeting that changed the course of her life, Cecilia was reviewing some documents in her makeshift office at the living room table when she received a notification on her phone. It was a news alert. Former banker Henry Vance arrested again for financial fraud. She felt no hatred, no vengeance, not even satisfaction, just a strange peace, as if a cycle had finally closed. Henry had chosen his path, just as she had chosen hers. Justice, though delayed, was finally served. That same night, Cecilia received an unexpected invitation. Richard Albright announced his retirement after 3 decades at the helm of the company. The administrative board, unanimously, decided to invite her to assume the presidency. She would be the first woman to hold the position in the corporation's 75-year history. The proposal was tempting. It represented the ultimate recognition of her journey, the crowning of a career rebuilt from the ashes. But Cecilia surprised everyone with her request for time to reflect. "Why hesitate?" Richard asked, genuinely intrigued. "It's the top, Cecilia, the place you always deserved." "Precisely why I need to be sure it's the place where I can be most useful," she replied with serenity. "Power is not an objective, it's an instrument." The next morning, after a night of reflection, Cecilia presented her counter-proposal to the board. She would accept the presidency, but with one non-negotiable condition: the creation of an innovative shared governance model, which would include representatives elected by employees at all levels in strategic decision-making processes. "A company is not the exclusive property of its shareholders," she argued. "It is a living ecosystem, sustained by the work, creativity, and commitment of every employee. Everyone should have a proportional voice in its destiny." The proposal generated intense debate. There was resistance, naturally. Centuries of hierarchical corporate tradition do not transform overnight. But Cecilia's earned credibility, combined with the tangible results of her inclusive policies over the last year, decisively tipped the scales. "We will make history," the board chairman finally announced. "Albright will be a pioneer in this governance model in the United States." Cecilia's inauguration as president was scheduled for the following month. The ceremony, traditionally restricted to executives and major shareholders, was completely reformulated at her request. Held in the main auditorium, open to employees of all levels, broadcast online to branches and international partners, it transformed into a true celebration of the new organizational culture. When she stepped onto the stage, Cecilia carried with her not only her personal achievements but the hopes of transformation for thousands of workers who, like her, one day felt invisible or underestimated. "My story is not exceptional," she said into the microphone, looking at the packed auditorium. What was exceptional was having received a second chance when so many talents remain unexplored due to prejudices, stereotypes, or simple indifference. Today we celebrate not just a new president, we celebrate a new concept of leadership based on empathy, inclusion, and shared purpose. Her words resonated far beyond that auditorium. They were reproduced in newspapers, analyzed in business schools, discussed in corporate forums. The Albright methodology, as it became known, inspired other corporations to review their governance and human development practices. 2 years later, on a typical workday morning, Cecilia found a handwritten note on her desk. Familiar handwriting, simple paper. 10 years ago, I cleaned this same desk every morning, dreaming of a day when people like us would be heard and respected. You made that dream a reality. Thank you for not forgetting where you came from. Zelda. That simple note, more than all the awards and accolades accumulated, symbolized the true meaning of her journey. It was not about power, status, or personal claim. It was about collective transformation, about opening paths, about showing that true leadership is born from the ability to recognize the intrinsic value in every human being, regardless of their position in the social or corporate hierarchy. That afternoon, as she walked through the office, Cecilia stopped to talk to a young woman pushing a cleaning cart, a new employee recently hired, eyes bright with dreams bigger than her current occupation. "How's the work going?" she asked with genuine interest. "Well, Mrs. Morrison," the young woman replied, surprised to be noticed by the president. "I'm studying business administration at night. One day I want to work in the finance department." I'm sure you will, Cecilia smiled. And when that day comes, remember to look at those who come after you with the same eyes of possibility, not limitation. As she walked away, she thought about how life takes unexpected turns, how seemingly sealed destinies can be rewritten when fair opportunities meet determined talents. Her story, which began with a dizzying fall and a decade of anonymity, had transformed into a powerful and strong symbol of resilience and renewal. The power she now held was never the goal. It was merely the instrument to realize a broader vision of the corporate world, where competence and humanity walk hand in hand, where financial success and positive social impact are not mutually exclusive, where no one needs to leave their essence at the door to be accepted and valued, as was her merit. Years ago, when she swept empty corridors before dawn, Cecilia Morrison never would have imagined that one day her name would be synonymous with business transformation and inspiring leadership. And perhaps that was the most important point of her entire journey, to show that the extraordinary often hides in the most improbable places, in the most underestimated people, in seemingly concluded stories. It was what she always repeated in her lectures, the mantra that now guided not only her life, but an entire new generation of leaders inspired by her example. We all carry unexplored potential within us. The true leader is not one who shines alone. It is one who recognizes and unleashes the brilliance of others. The end of the story. Dear listeners, we hope Cecilia Morrison's story has touched your hearts and shown how dignity and talent can endure even in the most adverse circumstances. To follow more inspiring narratives like this, be sure to check out our special playlist of stories of overcoming, available by clicking to your left. If this journey of new beginnings and transformation has awakened something in you, show your support with a like on the video and share your impressions in the comments. Your own story of resilience and hope can inspire other listeners in the community. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive new stories daily, authentic accounts that explore life's complexities, unexpected challenges, and the incredible human capacity to rise from the ashes. After all, as Cecilia taught us, the extraordinary often hides in the most improbable places.